All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. This has been the culmination of really quite a lot of work. We convened the Equal Vote Coalition's 5-star proportional research committee almost 2 years ago, or maybe exactly 2 years ago. And it's been a long process of vetting proposals and looking at the entire issue with a deep dive lens. So I've got a screen share for you. I'm going to pull that up. And then we've got a couple presenters, so we'll introduce those people. But before we get that going, we've got Jameson on the call. I've got him unmuted now. Jameson, are you there?
Hi, yes.
Fantastic, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me. Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, so my name is Sarah Wolk. I'm the executive director of the Equal Vote Coalition. And with me here tonight, we've got Keith Edmonds and Jameson Quinn. We've also got Annie Callan, who's going to be helping officiate the call. And yeah, so Keith, do you want to go first? Can you tell us a little bit about your background in this field and what got you interested in proportional representation?
Sure. So I'm Keith Edmonds. My actual background's in physics, but I work in data science and machine learning. And I'm from BC, Canada. A few years ago, Fair Vote and a few other organizations managed to get a referendum here. And I hadn't really looked into it too much as more of a passive observer. And when I started looking into it, I noticed that none of the experts were actual experts, and a lot of the things they said were wrong in the face of it, both on the yes side and the no side. And so as soon as I started digging, there was just like a void of people. And eventually I found Warren from Range Vote, and then I found Center for Election Science, and then finally Equal Vote. And so there are a few places out there, but it's not, even then there wasn't a lot of people spending a ton of time on it. They're pretty few and far between. And so then I dug into it and spent a couple of years now doing it. So yeah.
Appreciate it. How about you, Jameson? Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about your background in this field? And yeah, for starters. And you're muted again.
Yeah, I know.
There you go.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, my name is Jameson Quinn. I've been interested in voting reform, both single winner and multi-winner, for over 20 years now. In terms of multi-winner, like I was involved somewhat with the British Columbia effort that Keith just talked about. I organized a symposium there of the experts that were like one of the more like actual expert symposiums that happened there in BC. We co-organized that, the BC Symposium on Proportional Representation. I also designed the proportional representation method that's used for the nominations of the Hugo Awards. That was, instituted in response to an attack by some trolls, like using strategic voting. It's a long story, but anyway, so I was really happy to be part of this committee and to support this effort. So yeah.
Awesome. And what do you do for your day job? Just real quick. Why is it muting you?
Sorry. Yes. It turns out I can mute myself, but I can't unmute myself. So my day job, I am a statistician. I have a PhD in statistics, which I actually got because of my interest in voting reform here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, from Harvard.
Awesome. Thank you. So let's see. So for this presentation, we're going to start with a little bit of background in the subject. Proportional representation really is, in a lot of ways, the cutting edge. It's been around for a long time, but it's more complex than single winner voting methods. So we're going to start pretty simple, give you guys some background, and then as this presentation continues, you're going to get to the full shebang from deep dive and philosophical considerations. So hopefully this will stay accessible, even though we're gonna get into some really cool nerdy stuff. If anyone has questions during the presentation, just pop them in the chat. And if they're a clarifying question, Annie can read it out to us and we can address it, without getting too far ahead of ourselves. But we're gonna have a Q&A at the end for new questions. So hopefully we'll cover it all. So the big question that a lot of people have is single winner, multi-winner, or proportional representation. There's really three ways you can do it, regardless of the type of ballot, whether you're going with like choose one or ranked choice or star voting or score voting. For any of those options, you can do a basic single winner election, a multi-winner election, where you're electing like the top most popular candidates, or a proportional election where you're representing a representative set of winners so that everybody will have a voice at the table. So for single winner star, the two highest scoring candidates are finalists, and the finalist preferred, who is scored higher by more voters, wins. Single winner star is ideal for single winner district elections, like some councils, some legislatures, and for executive offices especially, like mayors, governors, and presidential elections. For multi-winner block star, that's the basic multi-winner star voting version. And the way that works is it just repeats single winner star voting until all the seats are filled. That's best for multi-winner elections where the goal is to elect majority preferred winners with the strongest popular support. And then proportional star voting uses a star ballot, but then it's tallied for proportional representation. And we'll get more into that later. But for multi-winner elections, the goal, this is for multi-winner elections where the goal is to elect a diverse body. And it's ideal for parliaments, legislatures, multi-member districts, or councils, where ensuring that representation for ideological differences and diverse viewpoints is a priority. Let's see here. And then the second question that really comes into play here is districting. For a single winner election, obviously, you're going to have a single winner district. But for multi-winner systems like basic multi-winner or proportional, you need a multi-seat election. And there's actually some intrinsic advantages to doing it different ways, either way. So single seat districts ensure proportionate geographical representation. That means you would have one person from each district, one person from each side of the tracks, and that can be really important in certain cases. With single seat districts, each voter has one representative to go to when there's an issue. It's the easiest for holding elected officials accountable. And it often helps localized communities of color to win, especially in places with histories of redlining or pervasive disparities. So multi-seat districts give candidates or give voters more different candidates to choose from. If great candidates end up living nearby each other, they can both win. And multi-seat districts are required for proportional representation. They also can be a great way to combat gerrymandering. Obviously, if there's less lines dividing the different districts, there's just less lines to be cheating. And then the third option here is a bit of, encompasses some of the advantages of both, and that's regional clusters and other hybrid districting methods. So hybrid methods can ensure that each cluster of districts are proportional and that each district has a local representative. So there's a few ways to do this. We're not gonna spend too much time on it right now, but Keith, did you have something to add on the local district option? And then we'll go to Jameson with another little quick thing.
Sure. So the one that I tend to favor of those options is the one, it was actually invented here in Canada by Dr. Byron Baker. And basically the idea is that you have your multi-member district, but you still keep track of the kind of the sub-districts. And when somebody's elected from in one of those sub-districts, all the other candidates in that would lose. So that you're really making sure that you're getting, when you're picking from the larger region, when you get one person from the sub-region, the other people that are from that region are out of the race too. So it's a little bit more aggressive on who you remove in order to maintain the regional stuff that you get. So you get the regional stuff as well as the proportional stuff, because it's arguably just as proportional.
Nice. And Jameson, did you have something to add on that too?
Yeah, I mean, Keith basically said it, but I mean, I think the key thing is that in order to make a hybrid system, you have to have a base system to start from. So basically, we're going to spend most of this presentation talking about the base system, the proportional method, the multi-seat style method, and then if you wanted to, you could also take that one step further, add on the clustering stuff, and then you would get sort of like the hybrid advantages. But in order to get there, you still have to start from a multi-seat method.
Nice. And we have a clarifying question, perfect example, right in the chat where it's supposed to be.
Local PR is the name of the STV. So if you take STV and you apply this this clustering mechanism to it, then you get local PR. But you can apply it, like Jameson said, to literally any multi-member system. Local PR is just the name for when you apply that to STV.
Yeah, and they picked a pretty non-specific, inclusive sort of name for that. So maybe that's the umbrella term.
It's good for branding, probably.
Right. Well, let's see. Back to my screen share. All right. So this is the $1 million question. What is proportional representation? Some of you might already know a lot about this, but some of you might not. It has been the main faux pains to date, but it is something that once people do their deep dive and they get into electoral reform, we hear a lot of like, oh, is this like a parliamentary system, or is this proportional representation? So now you'll be able to field that question. Proportional representation, sometimes called PR for short, if you're trying to confuse people from a marketing background. Proportional representation is a criteria or a measure on the results of an election where parties or factions win seats in proportion to the percentage of voters who support them. If a faction has support from 1/3 of the voters, they'll win one of the 3 seats up for election. And this is true for any proportional representation system. Elections yielding proportional representation can be run with any type of ballot, 5-star, ranked, or choose one. But just like with single winner elections, the more expressive the ballot, the more representative the results will be. And trying to get it to flip my slide the other direction. There we go. So one of the most common and kind of easy to conceptualize types of proportional representation is party list. Proportional representation is easy to think about in terms of political parties, where a faction or a party with 1/4 of the votes would win 1/4 of the seats. Many countries in Europe use closed party list type proportional systems, where voters vote for a party and not for their candidates individually. Closed party list systems can increase partisanship and polarization and can advantage party insider types over grassroots candidates. In the USA, almost half of the electorate is not registered with any party. Although open party list systems address some of these problems, they're unnecessary when using star-type ballots. Thus, our committee didn't consider party list proposals for this project. When nonpartisan proportional systems are used, proportionality itself can be a little harder to define. Terms like proportional, semi-proportional, and proportionate are all common labels, but what that means in the context of a given system can be vague. Luckily, different pass-fail criteria and metrics can be used to evaluate how systems behave. If a faction has a quota worth of voters, and if they can always win a seat by voting as a block, then a method passes Hare quota criterion. So here we have a pie chart, and it's showing perfect proportional factions. Each party is, we have a 3-party system or a 3-faction block of voters, and obviously who should win here is quite simple. But only exact proportionality has a single unambiguous definition. Let's see. A seat allocation is proportional only if the seat shares are equal to, sorry, having a little clicking around difficulties because my view is covering my slides. There we go. Yeah, the seat allocation is disproportional. In most cases, factions are not perfectly cohesive and are not perfectly sized to fill the seats available. If it's unclear who deserves a seat, a quota formula will determine who gets the extra seat. There are two common types of quotas, Hare and droop quotas. Hare quotas favor smaller factions, and droop quotas are more resistant to strategic voting. Obviously, there's more to that than just that, but without going too in-depth on that. Quotas determine how many voters will ensure a win. Because some factions are bigger than needed, sometimes candidates can win with a lower threshold than the quota. So if we have perfect proportional factions, each faction is going to win one of the 3 seats. But realistically, maybe we have 5 factions of different lumpy and overlapping characteristics. So actual candidates, the actual threshold needed for a candidate to win may vary. If not enough candidates can meet the threshold, then that extra seat has to go to somebody. So thresholds and measuring proportionality. The proportionality of a given election can be measured after the fact by looking at what percentage of voters elected a candidate that they feel represented by. The more winners in a race, the lower threshold required to win a seat, and the higher the expected proportionality of the election. Very low thresholds come with trade-offs, often allowing highly polarizing factions to win. If there were 10 winners and a candidate was strongly opposed by 90% of voters, they could still win. Elections with too many winners sacrifice accountability and come at the cost of local and geographic representation. Diversity, representation, and proportionality. Switching to proportional representation will help elect more diverse winners. But since we aren't talking about a party list proportionality, it does raise the question, diverse how? Well, that depends on what the voters care about in a given jurisdiction, what they prioritize, and what sets the factions of voters in the election apart from each other. Considerations that are likely to come into play include party affiliation, but also include geographical representation, equitable representation, if that's important to voters, and candidates' positions on the issues. So it's important to keep in mind that while proportionality has been shown to increase candidate diversification, which technically is descriptive representation, it can't guarantee proportionality of any one characteristic. So that's kind of setting the stage for, that kind of sets the stage for what brought about this committee that we convened. And it's a big topic. Do we have anything else to say before I jump into the committee project part of the call?
There were a couple of questions in the chat. Did you want to answer those now, or do you want to wait till the end?
If they're clarifying type questions, sure, but if they're bigger questions, no.
Oh, okay, they're more bigger questions, so we'll wait.
All right. So the Equal Vote 0 through 5-star Proportional Representation Research Committee. In 2018, Equal Vote convened a committee to determine the best way to tally a 5-star ballot for the best proportional representation possible. Despite the long history of proportional representation, this field is still very much the cutting edge of modern voting theory. So we set out to raise the bar, bringing theoretical, philosophical, and empirical considerations together. So we convened a forum where we would start doing our work. We started inviting people. We pretty much invited everyone who had already been active in this space in these conversations in the past, and then opened it up to a much larger group of people who were interested in joining. We did invite a lot of people, tried to come up with some more diverse representation on our committee itself, and ended up with at least a group that is quite diverse in terms of preferred voting method. So we didn't have a bunch of people who all prefer star voting answering this question. We had approval voting advocates and score voting advocates and star voting advocates, and we consulted ranked choice advocates as well. So this presentation, I did actually download it into like an ebook type of thing. So later on, if I'm covering a lot of material and you want to go back and read that entire welcome email, we're going to be sharing that link. Annie could probably drop that link in the chat now, and but you'll be able to reference all of this later. So let's see, the cutting edge. After 2 years of studying and refining proposals, our committee now has vetted proposals, and we recommend proportional star voting for real elections. But is our work done? No. We've identified what we want in a proportional representation method, but as with single winner, no system is perfect in every way. We've eliminated or refined systems that didn't measure up, and we have a few methods that are identified that are excellent. So allocated score, sequentially spent score, and sequential Monroe are the 3 systems that made it to the last round of our committee's vetting process, and they were all contenders to be our final proposal. Reweighted range voting ended up getting a variation that brought it to being, there's a type of reweighted range voting that's kind of the best in class for its type of proportionality, but didn't end up making the final cut. Because this field is still advancing rapidly, our recommendation at this stage was a conservative one, which many fans of single transferable vote will find quite familiar. viability was one key consideration. So I don't monologue too much for this presentation. Love to hear a bit more from Keith and Jameson. So when you first started out and agreed to be on this committee, what were some of your goals and expectations going into the project? And how did those goals and expectations change over the course of the discussions we had?
Jameson, you want to go first? You've been in this game a lot longer.
So yeah, I mean, I think like there's a lot of energy around voting reform in general, and especially like more and more these days. You know, people are more you know, looking at this kind of thing as a solution to the various problems we have in politics, or at least a partial solution. You're never going to solve everything, but so I think it's really important to have proportional methods be a part of that conversation. I don't think that just single winner methods can solve all the problems that proportional methods can. Although of course there are some cases where you can't apply proportional methods. When you can, they're a lot better. So I'm really happy to see this, like a committee like this, which is really pushing the boundary of what's possible with proportional methods. And I was really happy to be part of that. I'm like, yeah, I think that's enough for right now. Like, go ahead, Keith. What do you have?
So the question was about how, if I thought that we'd get to this point, or
what were your goals and what were your expectations going into the project, and how did that change?
I mean, so my goal, so I have my own system. One of the ones that we mentioned, not the one that made it the final. And I thought that, you know, I had the Holy Grail, and I just needed to show it to people, and they would be convinced, and everything would be well with the world. Obviously overly optimistic and naive. So my goal was obviously to just kind of say, hey, let's do this one. At that point, the major contender, at least that I knew of, was STV, and being better than STV isn't particularly complicated. And yeah, so that's basically my goals.
Yeah,
things did change a lot along the years.
Just to jump in really quick, single transferable vote, or STV, is the proportional ranked choice voting method that sometimes is just called ranked choice voting, but yeah, technically that's single transferable vote, and we'll talk a bit more about what that is later. But for me, I ended up co-chairing the committee with Keith, and for me, my goals were pretty lofty. We had, I think, single winner star voting. Our team felt pretty confident that we have something really fantastic that really delivers on goals from the warring factions in the voting reform movement. But those factions are very much real and very much separate. So on one side, there's like the ordinal faction that likes ranking things. And then on the other side, you've got the cardinal faction that likes scoring type systems. And just as much as those two factions kind of disagree on everything for single winner voting, those two factions disagree with each other, and also internally have all sorts of disagreements on each side. So my goal here was, if I could reach out to experts in the field whose opinions I really respected, and try and invite them to come together on a consensus proposal, then we could maybe, you know, unite the warring tribes, and people might feel a little more invested in the practical goal of, like, if we actually do come together and say, this is a really good system, whether or not it's my personal favorite system. Having that type of consensus has the ability to allow us to go into the reform space, the actual activist side of it, with a much stronger foundation. And then from the star voting side, we had ideas about different ways to do proportional star voting, but we didn't actually have any fantastic evidence or empirical proof for why our proposal should be taken seriously. And I knew that that wouldn't be something that would be accomplished overnight, but I figured it was something that would take forever. And so we might as well start it as early in the process as possible. And I think that was 2017, we started having these questions, and early 2018 that Keith and Jameson really started to have these in-depth conversations with me. And then pretty shortly after, we convened the committee. And I kind of glossed over it, but our mandate for the committee was pretty narrow. So we didn't set out to find like, what is the best proportional representation method ever? Or what is the best voting method ever? Or even what is the best way to do multi-winner elections? Those were all beyond the scope. We just set out to compare apples with apples and try and find the best way to tabulate a 0 through 5 star ballot, assuming not a giant winner set, not a huge field of candidates, or not a huge field of winners. And
but that said, there's a good argument that multi-winner cardinal is the best class. People are, of course, going to disagree on that, but it's not like we just chose a random class and then found the best within that class.
Right. So we definitely considered hybrid stuff, different methods that included looking at the preference order like STAR does. STAR is a hybrid between ordinal and cardinal, but we ended up with a proposal that is a cardinal proportional system. So let's see, one other thing is, yeah, we didn't look into party list type systems. We just looked at systems that would work in a nonpartisan situation. And am I missing anything? Were there any other like mandates that narrowed down our, oh yeah, complexity.
Yeah.
So we kind of put a cap on complexity. There are some like brilliantly perfect outcomes that can be achieved if complexity is no object. But we did just right off the top eliminate from consideration methods that had like over a page of code. I think that was thrown around. Depending on the font size, you could.
There's also the optimization class of methods.
Yeah.
So we choose a winner, then do something, then choose another winner, then do something, then choose another winner. There are ones that optimize a function and choose all the winners at the same time. As soon as you start talking about optimizing functions, you're going to lose a fair bit of people due to complexity.
Right. So, you know, in single winner voting, we've got methods that elect a winner all in one step, or that have like rounds of elimination or rounds of winner selection. And then we have like the Corsair type single winner systems that just look at all the data at once and then pick the best candidates. That kind of approach where you're just looking at all the data at once, you're not doing it in rounds, that can be applied to proportional representation. And if complexity was no object, those classes of systems are definitely really promising. But at this stage in history and technology, we didn't get into that. So, because this field is still advancing rapidly, our recommendation at this stage was a conservative one, which many fans of single transferable vote, the ranked choice proportional method, will find quite familiar. And viability was a key consideration. We didn't just look at which system do we prefer, we looked at which system might everyone support or adopt. ideally adopt beyond just support it. So presenting allocated score voting. So allocated score is the tabulation method that we ended up adopting as our proportional star proposal. And winners in proportional star voting, allocated score, are selected in rounds. Each round elects the candidate with the highest total score and then designates a quota worth of voters from that candidate's strongest supporters as represented. Subsequent rounds will include all voters who are not yet fully represented. So this is an allocated type system. And what that means is that voters will each be allocated to a candidate that they helped elect. And then I will be represented by that candidate, that winner. And my ballot will kind of go into that winner's pile. So ideally you'll have a couple of winners and they'll each have a stack of voters that they're representing in broad strokes. But the details of that are more nuanced. So the tabulation step by step can be broken into 3 parts. First, we've got our winner selection. How are we picking who wins in each round? How are we allocating the voters? Exactly. And then fractional surplus handling. So for winner selection, for each seat up for election, the highest scoring candidate is elected. So voters will score all their candidates 0 through 5 stars. And the highest scoring candidate is going to be elected as your first winner. Then you take 1 quota's worth of the winner's strongest supporters and allocate those voters to that winner. And that happens in groups. So first you'll take the people who gave that winner 5 stars and you'll allocate those all to the winner. And then if the quota is not full, you'll allocate the people who gave that winner 4 stars. If the quota is not full, you continue until the quota has been filled. But what you might find is that adding in that final group will fill the quota and then some. So that's where fractional surplus handling comes into play. And basically it is just how it sounds. You take those surplus votes and then you fractionally divide them up between that last group of voters and give some back. So the analogy that I really like there is if me and my friends went in on pizza, the pizza was $23.50, then we would maybe pay $25, we'd get some change back, and then we'd split that change between us. So yeah, fractional surplus handling. Most of the time, the final group added will be a bit larger than needed. In this case, the extra votes will be returned to that group and distributed evenly between them. These voters will still have some influence on future winners. So allocated voters, those ballots are now set aside. If they've been fully allocated and they didn't get any surplus handling change back, then their ballot's not going to be counted in the next round of voting or the next round of tabulation. But if a voter isn't fully supported yet, they have some of that change, then their ballot's still going to have some influence, just a lot less, depending on how many voters, supported that winner. So an example there is like, let's say the quota needed to fill, the quota to win a seat is like 100 voters, but this winner is super popular and they had 150. So they have like enough voters for a winner and a half. So that extra like half a quota of voters, rather than saying like, you're already represented, you don't have a say in the future rounds, giving those voters some change will allow that faction to try and earn a whole second seat. They may not have enough votes to deserve a whole second seat of representation, but they will have some influence on who else might win. And so they're able to get a next winner who's somewhat representative of them.
So if each of those 150 voters has like a third of a vote left after the first one gets elected, then that's 50 votes of power, but spread over those 150 votes.
Right. Yeah, anything else to add on that, you guys? And if not, do we have any clarifying questions at this stage? Hearing none, I'll just keep plowing forward.
There was a question. Is there a method to splitting up the final quota group? So I think the key part is to realize that these groups of people aren't actually in groups. They are individuals, and what the method is doing is finding groups out of it. So if, say there's some say somebody loses a third of their vote because they were part of a quota or something like that, they go back into the pool for the next round of finding a group, but just with 1/3 the power. Or wait, did I say they lose a third? If they lose a third, they'll have 2/3 the power, or vice versa. Right?
Right. So you'll spend your vote in proportion to the amount of representation that you've already earned. And
So yeah, so there's a question, how much of the quota? So in a 5-seat district, a hair quota would be 20%, like 1/5, and the troop quota would be 17%, 1/6 of the full total of voters. So those are the two quotas that you might be using.
yeah, and I thought I'd just pull up the ballot. So for voters, when you're doing proportional representation, you just need to know, score of the candidates, relative to the amount of support you have for them. The ballot is going to show you how many winners there are going to be for the election. You're scoring everyone from 0 through 5 stars. The rules and the voter experience is exactly the same as for a single winner election. So one thing that we often find, and definitely with like the ranked choice voting camp, when they're advocating for single transferable vote, is like, I once went to a 3-hour presentation on single transferable vote, and they never once mentioned the tabulation or the algorithm or the quotas in any more than broad strokes. They were just like, hey, if you have 1/4 of the voters, you're going to win 1/4 of the seats. And they spent the 3 hours talking about, the types of representation and the advantages of that on society and the projects underway to do that. So definitely we can have a follow-up presentation where we get into that side of proportional representation. But our goal tonight really is to kind of lift the hood, let everyone kick the tires. And we do think that if a voting method tabulation is to be viable, it should be transparent. So definitely as reformers, we want to be transparent. So
Sarah, before you go on, there's another clarifying question. So some folks are asking if there's a visual to explain this. I don't know if you have any flow chart or anything like that.
we don't have a flow chart, and that's a great idea. It's definitely follow-up that we're going to be doing. So one thing is like our proportional representation committee isn't done. Our work isn't done forever, but we do have a proposal that's vetted, that's fact-checked, and that is ready to be adopted for people who are chomping at the bit to adopt something right away. And so we'll definitely be doing follow-up, we'll be doing videos, and we'll be doing actually more studies, more data to back up these types of things.
I just posted the ElectoWiki page That does not have a flow chart on it. The person that has been making all the flow charts is MIA at the moment, so we have to track him down. If anybody's a great graphic designer, you're welcome to help us. This is a volunteer community effort, right?
Right. So I do have this chart. So this chart takes a couple of different proportional methods across the top and then breaks them down into those different mechanisms. So what type of voting method is it? Does it use a ranked ballot, a star ballot? And then what's our winner selection? How are we selecting winners? What's our proportional mechanism? How are we saying this voter is represented and we're going to set them aside and let other people have a say? And then how are we handling surpluses, or, you know, when a faction has more voters than they needed? So on the left, we've got single transferable vote, the ranked choice method. And the way that works is you start off with a ranked ballot, and for a single winner, single transferable vote election, it works exactly like instant runoff voting. But it can be used for multi-winner as well. And so the way that works is you're counting voters' top ranking, eliminating candidates off the bottom, and then reallocating or redistributing rankings until somebody has a majority of votes. And then once somebody's elected, then with single transferable vote, full voters are always allocated. There's no scenario where one person's ballot is like half of it's going to that candidate, but they're not fully represented, so they get to have some influence later. So if my fifth choice was elected in single transferable vote, and that was the first winner that I've gotten, and I end up in that winner's quota, then my vote might be fully exhausted or fully used up on a candidate that I really didn't love. And so that's kind of one of the problem statements of why not just go with single transferable vote. We think ideally, if I don't feel represented as a voter, if I didn't get a candidate that I didn't like, or if I didn't get a candidate that I like, I should have a chance to get more representation in later rounds. So in single transferable vote, when if a candidate ends up with like too many voters in their quota, what you'll do is take, usually, and different jurisdictions may have variations on this. There are actually a lot of variations on single transferable vote done around the world. But generally, voters are sorted by ranking, and then voters who gave that candidate the same ranking will be like randomly picked, and they'll just take as many of them as they want. And then, so some voters get allocated away and some don't. So that means it's somewhat random. Like, you know, I could randomly allocate away all the voters who prefer Keith as their next choice, and then leave all the voters in play that prefer Jameson. And so depending on who you're allocating away and who you're leaving, some voters with the same ranking might be treated differently, and that can skew things or feel a little unfair. And so I'm kind of the explainer in this group. I'm the one who tries to take wonky concepts and explain them in lay terms. And I may not be doing a fantastic job there, but did that make sense? Or did I get anything wrong, guys?
No, that sounds good to me. There's one question here. They're asking about the surplus handling in Minneapolis. I do not know anything about the Minneapolis system, but I do know that you can't do fractional surplus handling on a rank, because a fraction means that you're dividing, like taking a fraction of, so your weight is worth some fraction less. And I don't know how that would work with a rank, because you can't.
So they just count the vote as that much of a vote, and then they see when it gets to a quota, like adding up those fractions. So it is true that is possible to do STV that way, and that Minneapolis does that. Here in Cambridge, we actually do use for the municipal elections, we use STV as well, and here we do use the random thing. So it's definitely true that in practice the random thing is common. Sometimes the fractional thing gets used, but yeah.
Right. And, when you're allocating full ballots, that definitely can feel simpler. But when you're looking at like, is that fair? Or, hey, me and Keith had the same ballot. We had the same rankings, but I still have full influence and he doesn't have any going forward. That can feel unfair. And that's where single transferable vote doesn't necessarily pass some key criteria like equality criteria or monotonicity criteria and a few others. Because, depending on which voters' rankings are counted, just like with single winner ranked choice, not all the rankings are counted, and which rankings get counted can determine, can really actually make a difference. So that's just single transferable vote. And we already talked about our system that we're recommending, allocated score. So the way allocated score works, and one of the reasons we really liked it, is that it actually pretty much works like single transferable vote, but with a 5-star ballot. So it's almost as close as possible in a lot of ways. It's got the 5-star ballot, not a ranked ballot. For the winner selection, you're taking the highest scoring candidate. So that's the simplest way to do that. And then for the proportional mechanism, voter groups are allocated based on the score given. So you're just taking a winner's strongest supporters and you're allocating those ones. And then for the fractional surplus handling, extra stars are returned to the group on the edge of the quota and are shared equally between them. And the reason we like that is because two voters with the exact same ballot are going to be treated exactly equally, and they're going to have exactly the same amount of influence going forward. So another system that that we looked at really closely, and that was really our front runner for a lot of definitely like our final phase of the voting committee, we kind of narrowed it down to 3 methods. And those were allocated score, sequential Monroe, and then sequentially spent score. And all 3 of those we thought were really great systems, had really strong advantages and made sense in some really cool ways once we got into the weeds of it. So, so anyone else want to explain sequential Monroe, or should I?
Actually, I think we should not go into the details of all those others. Just to say that those do exist, but for this purpose, I don't think we need to like explain every single possibility.
All right. Well, yeah. Sequential Monroe is like allocated score, but you were taking the highest scoring candidate just in that quota of strongest supporters. So that's kind of some additional complexity, but it adds in a little bit of maybe additional awesomeness in terms of perfection. So that was why we really gave that variation some serious time of day. And then sequentially spent score is Keith's system. And I still really love it, I'm just gonna say. But Keith, do you want to tell us like a little bit about that? I don't want to gloss over it completely because it's going to come into play.
Sure. I mean, just high level, one quick difference to the allocated score is that instead of allocating the top scorers to that person, you allocate the, or you you subtract off the amount of ballot weight that they scored that person. You score somebody a 3, they lose a third if that person gets elected. So it's not all or nothing based on who supported them the most. Everybody loses what they scored that person. There's some fine points around how the surplus handling is then done in that case, but that's the gist of it.
So what I really liked about sequentially spent score is that you can kind of think of my ballot as being, I have 5 stars to spend. And if somebody that I gave 5 stars to is elected, then I spend my 5 stars and I'm fully represented. But if somebody that I gave 4 stars to is elected, then I've still got a star left. You know, I can't afford very much, but I can pool it with other voters to get a little bit more representation. And so that is a novel approach to proportionality that really is its own class of proportional methods. So the novelty of it, I think, is one of the reasons that we didn't pick that system and went with the simpler allocated score. Or when I say simpler, more traditional is perhaps a better way to say that. I think allocated score is one of the more kind of like traditional ways to approach this question. And whereas, yeah, sequentially spent score with the novelty, I think is really promising, but definitely it's going to be under more of a microscope, and it'd be great to have even more data to back it up. And then the fifth option here is reweighted range voting. That's something that many of you, if you've been interested in proportional cardinal systems for a while, have probably heard of. So reweighted range has the longest history in the cardinal space, but it doesn't pass the Hare quota criterion. So it's a proposal that if you're going to take this to a single transferable vote fan and say, hey, why don't you do this instead? They'd be like, hey, that's not even a proportional method. And that's totally debatable. There's really good responses on both sides for that. But that, in many ways, is like a debate that we don't want to get derailed on. We'd rather have a system that really just meets proportional criterion, no matter how you define it. And that's something that we've found to be really helpful with star voting. It's like, if you love comparing voting methods with simulations and you love voter satisfaction efficiency, then star voting does really well, single winner. But if you love Condorcet criterion, where the candidate who's preferred over all others wins, star voting also does really great at that. So it's a nice way to not have to argue about your metrics and just say, no matter how you slice this, we pass. And one other thing to say on that is that the standard reweighted range voting algorithm uses a Jefferson reweight, which we're not going to get into right now. But
the inventor does now endorse Webster, just for the record.
Yeah, it's similar to the difference between Droop and Hare quota. It's just when you're reweighting, you have to use different formulas, so it turns into these different names, but it's the same basic idea as the difference.
Yeah, so if we have any huge reweighted range voting fans on this call and you're like, whatever your committee says, I'm still going to use this system, definitely we would recommend, if you're going to use that, use the Webster version. And ElectoWiki is a great source for anyone who wants to read more about any of these types of things. There's really a lot of information there. And Zoom has really got to figure out how to make it easier to advance slides.
Are you sure pressing the arrows doesn't do anything?
It doesn't. It goes, wait, now it's working. It doesn't usually. Sometimes it goes like honk at me. But yeah, So next slide. How does allocated score, our proportional star presentation, compare to single transferable vote? So allocated score pairs with the great single winner method, and that is a huge advantage. So if you've got an electorate that has some single winner and some multi-winner and some proportional elections, you could use the same ballot for all of them. And that's just a huge selling point in terms of, voter education and cohesiveness. So allocated score works great for the 5-star ballot, works great for single winner, multi-winner, or proportional. And allocated score is monotonic, so voting for a candidate can't hurt them. Allocated score is less vulnerable to strategic voting than single transferable vote, and it produces less polarizing winner sets. Yeah. And then single transferable vote, conversely, pairs with instant runoff voting, which as a single winner method has some serious known issues. And it actually builds off of the instant runoff voting algorithm. So it maintains all of the glitchiness with single winner instant runoff voting, including non-monotonicity, which means that your vote can backfire and hurt you, or voting for a candidate can hurt that candidate. In particular, there's a strategy called free riding that can be pretty effective. And what that is like, if I think that somebody's going to win anyways, I might as well not rank them first. And that means that they'll win, but I won't be in their quota, so I'll get to still have influence. So you're kind of catching a free ride without paying for it. And Jameson definitely is an expert on free riding strategy. So I don't know if you have anything to add there.
We just got a question in the chat, actually. Why is allocated score fairly resistant to strategy in general?
Yeah,
that's what I was hoping Jameson might want to chime into.
So essentially the idea is when, like generally speaking, strategy, like you're either exaggerating how much you support somebody in order to help them get elected, or you're hoping they get elected, but you're lowering your support in order to just like kind of not get your vote used up when they do get elected. And those two kind of like incentives, like obviously there are two kinds of strategies, but like they're opposite in practice. And allocated score like basically has like uses the possibility of like both of those to sort of like play off against each other. Like in practice, if you try to do one strategy, you're hurting yourself in the other way, and if you try to do the other one, you're hurting yourself in that way. So there's really it's very rare that you can actually like in practice get ahead by using one without hurting yourself on the backside. So that's basically how I that's the best I can explain it. I mean, it's definitely a thing we found as a committee. So that's an intuition.
Yeah, and in terms of free riding, or at least a class called Woodall free riding, STV tends to be worse than pretty much all cardinal systems, and that's because when you use a ranking system, you're only really looking at the preference, or the first preference, or in later rounds the preference shown, so that the information is kind of buried. And in a cardinal system, you're showing kind of all of the data at the same time, so that the ability for that to work, it's more likely to bite you in the ass. So yeah, you can't get rid of strategy, you can't get rid of even free riding, but you can try and find the one that does the best.
Right. There's a proof that no voting method, either single winner or multi-winner ever, like unless it's dictatorial, unless it's just like randomly choose somebody and let them decide. No voting method will eliminate strategy. It's just impossible. So you just try to minimize it.
Right. And one of the things with proportional representation and more complex voting methods in general is that strategy, even if it is possible, would be like less actionable, harder to figure out. But obviously you don't want, smarter voters getting a better shake than voters who are just taking it at face value. You don't want the system playing favorites those ways. And definitely another thing with strategic voting, when you're talking about protecting against it, there's one, you just want voters to be honest because that's kind of an ethos. But also you can measure worst case scenario, if voters are strategic, how much harm is that really going to do? And so those are some considerations that we took into account there. And then, so back to the bottom of the bullet points for single transferable vote. Single transferable vote tends to favor more polarizing winners. And again, that's because not all of the data is being taken into account. When voters are giving their second choice, their third choice, their fourth choice, or they're giving scores like 3 stars, 2 stars, 1 star, what that really is laying your cards on the table and saying to the other voters, okay, here's what I want, but also here's where we maybe could find some consensus or compromise. And inherently, if you're giving that information that would help find a consensus candidate or a compromise candidate if one exists, you are, kind of compromising your power to some extent. And that's what later no harm criteria is about. But you also are, if you all come to the table and nobody's willing to compromise at all, you're just not going to get as good of decisions. So in order for a voting method to produce really great representative winners, you need that, that information on when voters can compromise or what matters to people beyond just their favorite. So yeah, single transferable votes, only looking at one ranking at a time, and that inherently leads to more polarizing winners for single winner, ranked choice voting, and multi-winner. And then, like I said earlier, surplus handling can feel unfair or kind of random, or it may actually be random. So these systems also have a lot in common. And again, one of the reasons we picked allocated score is because it really lets us compare proportional star and proportional rank choice like apples to apples. So both of them meet proportionality criteria, Hare criteria. Both are allocation methods where you're allocating voters. Both are quite expressive. You can show nuanced opinion on multiple candidates. And yeah, and they work pretty similarly. See, now it's not letting me advance with the button. But yeah, so a couple other systems. There's kind of 3 different schools of ways you can tabulate proportional representation. Allocating, like the 2 systems before, is one of the schools. Sequentially spent score, Keith's system, is a whole nother school where you're spending stars. And reweighted range voting is a whole 3rd school of voting, of proportional representation, where you're actually using an algorithm to say you've spent this many and we're going to like fractionally reduce your weight going forward.
There's a 4th school, the fragment school, which we don't talk about much because it only works with approval. It only works properly with approval. You can do some modifications.
Yeah, but one of the things we kind of did as a method of narrowing down the field of systems that we were studying is we tried to say, what's the best system in each class? Because you can compare those systems apples to apples, and then kind of narrowing down each class of voting method until we had kind of fine-tuned each parameter to be optimal or to be as good as possible. And so let's see, for sequentially spent score, we narrowed it down to a version with scaling, which probably doesn't need to be explained right now. But basically, voters are spending stars depending on how they scored each winner. And voters can't spend their whole vote on a candidate that they don't love. That's one big advantage. It's innovative and new, which is cool. I found it the easiest to explain to some lay people, but that's not something that we got a huge lot of poll testing on yet. Intuitively, the idea of I spent 3 stars, so I've got 2 stars left just feels very intuitive and fair. So we really definitely think this proposal is super promising for further study. And I think we know enough to say that if you really like this system and you want to use it, it really came out very strong in our committee. Would everyone agree to that?
Well, obviously I'm going to.
I do want to say that we did reach a consensus as a committee on allocated score, and you know there are reasons for that. So
yeah,
so I
there,
mean,
there definitely are. We'll get to that. There's another one that was in the top running for a long time called sequential Monroe. I wish Parker was here. He admitted that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So reweighted range voting again works by reweighting. So as voters gain representation, you reweight that ballot so that you still have some of your ballot weight in play going forward. And mathematically, that's the simplest tabulation out of the systems that we looked at. Basically, the algorithm is the shortest. And but it doesn't pass the hair quota criterion. So some people might classify that as a semi-proportional method. And probably should be said that in terms of representative outcomes or like electing a council that would do a great job, you know, semi-proportional methods may be just as good. You know, some people think all the way proportional is the best. Some people think all the way majoritarian, where you want majority preferred winners, is the best. And so semi-proportional methods are kind of in between. And that, you know, there are advantages to that, but it was kind of beyond the scope of our committee. We kind of figured we already have single winner star voting. We have multi-winner block if we want majoritarian outcomes. So let's deliver a proportional proposal that is fully really proportional, and that's going to really maximize that diversified representation. So reweighted range elects maybe less diversified winners, so more consensus type winners. And that means that overall, the like average voter satisfaction with the winner set would probably be better, but each person might feel less represented by a specific person. And that's one of the oldest cardinal PR proposals, I think originally invented by Warren Smith. And me being a non-mathematician, I definitely think it's less transparent to just have an algorithm. It's hard for me to really parse through why does this work and why does it feel fair. So this kind of gets us to the philosophical part of our committee's process. We got kind of to this end game stage where we'd narrowed it down to 3 really great systems. All of them had some pros and cons. You know, if you're willing to accept a little more complexity, you could maybe get a little more accuracy. If you're willing to, you know, if you tune in this parameter, then that, you know, has some other impacts in another area. And so in order to start parsing some of these like philosophical questions, we started asking things like, what is an ideal winner set? And so on the left, we've got this 4-colored block. And what that represents is a 2-dimensional political space, assuming an even distribution of voters. So let's say each square represents some voters, and voters towards the middle are going to be more like centrists type voters, more moderates perhaps, and voters in these far corners are going to be perhaps more polarizing winners, but definitely ideologically as diversified and as distinct from the others as possible. So any proportional method will elect one candidate from each of these 4 quadrants in a 4-winner race. But philosophically, are we better off with 4 more consensus winners, 4 maximally diversified winners or polarized winners? Or ideally, are we aiming for like somewhere in between? And this graph is a total oversimplification. Obviously, humans are not flat, and we don't fit into a 2-dimensional political space perfectly. But a couple things that I think this graph helps you visualize is that if we elected all the white dot candidates, you would have no candidates that are like super objectionable to someone. Like the blue side would say, you know, well, at least, you know, the red guy is someone I can talk to. They understand my point of view. They're closer to me. But, and if you elected the black dots, the more diversified candidates, you just have less overlap there, but people who are further towards those corners are going to feel like they really have somebody in their corner. They have somebody that really represents them. But a voter who's like towards the middle would be still pretty far away from a candidate in their faction if you elect a candidate from like all the way on the edge. So a candidate that's sort of splitting the difference is going to be able to make more voters feel more represented. And with sequential voting methods, it gets a bit complex as well, because you're like, okay, if we elect the highest scoring candidate as the first one, if our first winner is in that black dot far outside of the spectrum, then is it still proportional if we elect a blue white dot next? You know, so these are kind of questions that we started parsing through.
Yeah. Bear in mind that this is just kind of a representation, like a metaphor to try and understand that there's a trade-off between something more like consensus and something more like polarized. Those probably aren't even the best terms for that.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and we call it the Pareto frontier because, like, I can certainly imagine somebody saying, you know, 4 white candidates are better, or 4 gray candidates are better, possibly even all 4 black candidates are better. But there's certainly, like, if you had like green and red got their white candidate, and then blue and yellow got their black candidate, like the average would be way over into the blue yellow side, right? Like over to the right side. So that certainly wouldn't be fair. So there's certain combinations that are clearly like not fair. So like the the three options we've given, like 4 white, 4 gray, or 4 black, are all in some sense the frontier of the best possible. And like there's other things behind that frontier that are not even as good as those.
Right. So just philosophically, without even getting into simulations, we started trying to make some predictions about how our different voting methods might do in terms of this Pareto frontier, in terms of like how diversified or how polarizing are they going to be, or how centrist favoring and compromisey are they going to be. And so our predictions were that reweighted range voting was going to be more on the side of the consensus winners, the white dots, and that single transferable vote, the ranked choice method, was going to be more on the highly polarized side. And that holds true in single winner systems as well, if you're looking at ranked choice versus score voting. Ranked choice has a center squeeze where it really advantages those outer edges, and score voting has a center expansion where it really favors candidates that are kind of in the middle of the field of candidates. So we predicted that, and we also made some predictions about the other ones. So I think we thought sequential Monroe and allocated score and sequentially spent score were all going to be kind of in that gray dot range. And we thought maybe sequentially spent score would be on the outer edge of that. Is that right? The outer edge of the gray dot range.
Yeah, so sequential Monroe voting would be the same as STV in this sense. It would be what I would call clumpy or maybe polarized. And sequentially spent score would be, I guess, what the white is, and more caring about the interplay in the center. Yeah.
Yeah, so on the more on the inner edge of the gray dot, not all the way to the reweighted range voting side of the frontier, but further on the consensus side. So yeah, any more to say, you guys, on like philosophical considerations, or what you guys thought about that? Or did I kind of cover it? I'm trying to sum up like the long-winded musings of many people.
Yeah.
Here, so bear with me.
So there is more than one thing that is being represented by this interplay between the white, gray, and black. It's not just the clumpy or polarized versus consensus. There's also strategic resilience, and there's interplay with a bunch of other things, and it's about balancing them between each other. So given that, and we found for a number of different things that these four methods all lined up in the same way as they were making trade-offs between different things. For different metrics that were somewhat independent. Nothing's completely independent in this, obviously, but we got a similar narrative that things went in a similar direction when we looked at simulations. And so, yeah, so don't just think of it as in terms of one thing. So, you could be at the optimal point for one metric with one system, but that one might be a scooch too far for the 5 other metrics. You might want to shift a little bit over.
And just like I think that generally speaking, you're gonna want to end up somewhere in the gray dot range. Like voting methods, if you try to design your method to push yourself too far, if you like, even if philosophically you like, I really love those white dots, those look really good to me, or philosophically you're like, I really like the black dots, those look really good to me. Like if you design your voting method to like kind of push in to one extreme, strategy is going to like rebound and like maybe even take you to the other extreme. So it's good to like look for a method that's somewhere like a little bit towards the middle or a little bit towards the edge, but somewhere in the gray dot sort of general area.
Right. That's a really good point about how if you try and, game the system in one direction, you might end up accidentally gaming it in the opposite direction. And I think a really great example of that is our current choose one plurality voting system. So choose one plurality, by its nature, is just really vulnerable to vote splitting. And that makes it, when it does fail, it fails in favor of the most polarizing candidate. So whichever candidate stands out from the pack is the most likely to not have their voters split and is going to get that advantage. But voters, as a response, do this lesser evil voting thing where they're like, oh, I don't want to throw my vote away. I'm going to vote for the front runner who seems the most electable. And I don't want to risk anything here because I could get my entire vote wasted. So voters compromising for the super polarizing system often end up really electing a very kind of centrist.
And not even necessarily the actual center of where the voters actually are, just the center of where, the voters think the other voters think the voters are, like where the media tells people the voters are, or whatever, like some version of centrist that's not even reflecting, reality as it changes over time, is just like whatever was true 20 years ago.
Yeah, and that's where terminology got really difficult with this conversation, because the word centrist is loaded, the word polarizing is loaded, the word consensus is loaded, the word compromise is loaded, and people have really different associations with those. And when we're talking about a voting method, the voting method's like completely blind to the political spectrum as we conceive of it. It's just relative to like the voters, really the votes themselves, once you're translating opinions into base data. So that's all stuff that I think we had to keep reminding ourselves over and over again as we're debating these things. And definitely when I meet advocates for one system or another, I often find people who are like, oh, I really like that feature of instant runoff voting where it tends towards more polarized or more diversified winners, because I'm a third party voter and I think that might help me actually break two-party domination. But what we find is, like Jameson said, opening those doors can create a backlash with strategic voting. So definitely we want a system that doesn't play favorites, that's not biased in any direction or the other, but that is gonna ideally elect a good, stable set of winners that feels fair.
And there's a point being made in the chat about how these effects are rare and maybe it kind of doesn't matter in the end, which is, I guess, yeah, kind of true. And the difference between these various cardinal systems and the problematic effects is probably going to be relatively small. You take the same ballots, you do the calculation. In most cases, you're probably going to come up with mostly the same winners. But still, I mean, the cases where it matters matter, and this is voting. So if we can do better, we may as well. There's no reason to just kind of say these ones are all good, let's take one at random. If we can do our best, let's do our best. And yeah.
Right. And definitely that is a thing with multi-winner elections, especially sequential ones. Like if you pick the wrong winner in the first round, odds are the correct person's going to win in the next round, and you may end up with the same winner set, even if they're elected in the wrong order. So multi-winner systems in general can kind of like hide distortion or hide inaccuracies and fix some of those inaccuracies. But definitely whoever ends up getting elected last, there's no hiding if that was not the right person.
Yeah. And also two similar candidates, like say there's two similar candidates and they're about to be elected. One of them's going to be elected second. Exactly how you handle the first and the reweighting of the first could influence which of those two similar candidates get elected. And to those two candidates, that really matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we're getting towards the end of our committee's process. And so at this point, we'd had these philosophical debates. We had made some predictions. So we'd made some theories. We're like, all right, let's test the theory. Let's code some of these systems up. Both Keith and Jameson have a bunch of knowledge, expertise, and credentials in those areas. So we ran these simulations, and I'm going to talk you through them at a kind of broad strokes level, and then I'll let Keith get into it more. But what we've got is one out of, I think, 12 or so of these histograms that were created. And each one kind of measured a different metric that we wanted to look at. So this one's looking at largest totally unsatisfied group. So how many voters voted, election day came, they got the results, and they were like, oh, I lost. And
yeah, let's just back up a minute. So along the x-axis there, that's the percentage of the electorate. And so this graph is a histogram. It shows the counts from many, many different simulations. So I'm not going to spend too much time on explaining how to interpret that. But basically, if there's more on the y-axis, that means it's more frequently going to happen. And so you can't, in any of these systems, have more than a 15% error. So, or 15%, sorry, you can't have a group larger than 20% that are unrepresented, because that would be failing the Hare quota criteria. But how often do you get close? What's the largest group that is expressing a cohesive message for a specific candidate that is unrepresented? And you see there's some that get up to 15%, but I mean, in general, the ones that are further towards the left is what we want.
And then for lay people, one thing that you can get from just like looking at these wiggly lines is you start to see the systems laid out on the Pareto frontier the way we thought we would. So we've got the yellow line, the red line, and the dotted red line kind of on one side, more towards the left in this graph. And that's the allocated systems. And then on the blue line, you've got reweighted range voting, Webster version, kind of doing just the opposite extreme. And what we found is like that some criteria, some metrics that we wanted to study, when we're like, ooh, which method did the best in this graph? Like if you want to have, for this one, I think the, well, I'll let Keith do the interpretations.
So
yeah, what was some takeaways from this graph for you?
So from this graph, the one with the lowest mean is sequential Monroe. So it is at the far one side of that trade-off. The one that did the work, that would have, that did the worst should be reweighted range. Is that true by the numbers? Yeah, so reweighted range to the worst, sequential Monroe did the best. But it's important to realize that if you if you change metrics, it often flips. So reweighted range is best in terms of utility, but worse in terms of things like diversity. So this trade-off is balanced across metrics. If obviously if this ordering was the same for everything, but one side was always better for all metrics, obviously we just want to be slammed up at one side of that that trade-off. But that isn't the case. And these simulations really help with understanding, but they are they're very far from being a what I'd call an accurate simulation of how voters would behave. It doesn't have any strategy, and there's a few kind of, let's say, issues with assumptions I've made, but it is still useful for gaining general insights on most things that we kind of expected we saw.
Yeah, so definitely a lot of you have probably heard me cite voter satisfaction efficiency. Those are by Jameson here. They're his simulations. And pretty much across the board, people cite them as being some of the most sophisticated in terms of realistic assumptions, realistic scenarios, and kind of nuanced calculations about, what if voters do X and what if voters do Y? So these simulations are much more simple, but I do think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that these are some of the first simulations, like visualizations of proportional methods that have been done.
Yeah, so it really is much harder to like make the assumptions, like how would voters strategize in a proportional situation. It's very like, I mean, people are much more complex than little simulated silicon voters. So you're never going to get it exactly right. Even in the single winner case, I had to make simplifying assumptions for voter satisfaction efficiency for VSE, and I think like in a multi-winner case, you have to make even more. So people haven't done as much of that. These are in some of the first and some of the most comprehensive ones. And the point is that like even if you're making simplifying assumptions that you don't really believe, you're still like it's still better than just like coming up with one scenario and saying, well, I think this is what would happen, and somebody else comes up with their scenario and they say, I think this is what would happen. Here at least we get some balance of different possibilities and see how they all fit together. And yeah, you end up with the things you expect, which is really a good way to increase your confidence that you understand what's going on.
Yeah, and another thing is, if you know the assumptions you make, then when you're interpreting the results, you can kind of keep that in the back of your mind and interpret them accordingly. Somebody in the chat's asking, what would STV look like? I suspect STV would look a lot like sequential Monroe. Although we didn't code it because it takes a different ballot.
So yes, it would be sort of like on the sequential Monroe side, but it would be a little bit more random because of like the process of elimination. So it probably wouldn't be right up against the edge. So I think possibly it would be like less good than sequential row and row, where on the things where it's good, but just as bad where it's bad. I think
yeah, that's right, because it's hard to slam. The randomness will cause it to perturbate away from edges, but it'll keep it in bad areas because those aren't edges. Yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah. So another thing that I thought was a really interesting takeaway here, at the time we did this, we had, let's see, 3 systems that are pretty similar: sequential Monroe, allocated score, and allocated score by weight. So the red and yellow options are all like allocated type systems. And sequential Monroe was one that was like allocated score, but with a slightly more complex selection method. And so one thing that I wanted to see is like, how much gain do you get from that added complexity? And what we see from these, like, let's see, dotted red line versus the red line is that they almost really overlap in a lot of cases. So we weren't seeing like a huge difference that this one tweak in the algorithm made. And I think, if you're adding complexity and you're not getting a huge benefit from it, that's where we were like, okay, well, given what we know, it's hard to justify that added complexity at this time. But we also were like, hey, sequential Monroe's complexity, it's pretty logical why you would add that difference in the selection. And if you factored in things that we haven't been able to simulate yet, it may be that is worth it. It's just, we just didn't run those simulations yet.
Yeah,
so
the big step after this was when we started talking about strategy a lot.
Right. So do we want to, is there anything about strategy that we didn't cover that you guys wanted to say, or should we get into this real world application of this stuff and save a little time for Q&A? I think we probably covered it. So real world application. In the USA, proportional representation could be a great fit for the House of Representatives, in my opinion, or similar offices on the state level. But on a national level, proportional representation would require a constitutional amendment. So I think everyone here knows that that's really difficult to do and unlikely to happen. So if people are like, we're going to break the two-party system with proportional representation in the United States of America, and people do say that to me a lot, actually, I tend to caution with, you know, that may be like a multi-generational kind of a goal. So like that's probably not something you're going to accomplish this year.
So just to be clear, that means that like nationwide proportional all over the whole nation would in fact require a constitutional amendment. Would be possible without a constitutional amendment to have state by state proportionality in the House of Representatives, for instance, like, you know, like, and for a big state like California or New York or whatever, like that proportion, that would be actually quite proportional. But for a state with just one representative, like, you know, Wyoming or whatever, like proportional, like, you know, like the possible proportions are 0% and 100% because there's only one. So that's not actually proportional in that case. So there's a certain amount of proportionality you could get national, like federally, without an amendment, but it wouldn't be like the full all the way.
Yeah. So so definitely Oregon, proportional representation is constitutional, and that's going to vary state by state depending on their state constitution. But in countries like Canada and other countries with parliamentary systems, adopting star voting and proportional star as a package could actually be viable on a national level in a way that's really different than what we would see here in the States. So Keith, do you want to share a little on that, being from Canada?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a little bit, I'm actually quite optimistic that there's a path forward in Canada. There's talk about a citizens' assembly. So because this is complex and because politicians have a vested interest in the outcome, the best way to do is to try and get a representative sample of citizens, get them all in a big room, show them lots of presentations like this, and from amongst those people who are now informed on the thing, for them to give a recommendation that then goes to a referendum. Rather than what happened in BC was a bunch of people in power essentially chose the systems, and they weren't really great and they weren't really vetted, and almost everybody I talked to was pretty disappointed with how things went. Also, it gives a fair bit of legitimacy if the systems are actually chosen from people who were lay people and were schooled by experts, and even more so if those experts are unbiased, which is probably the most difficult thing to achieve.
Yeah, even in our own committee, you know, selection at the beginning, it was almost impossible to find experts who didn't have a horse in the race. So, you know, Keith went into it with his own system that he had come up with. Jameson also has his own proposal, which is called place voting, that doesn't use a 5-star ballot. So it wasn't one of the systems that we considered just for the mandate of this research committee, but for non-expressive ballot type systems, definitely something to look into there. And yeah, Jameson, did you want to say anything about that?
I mean, I don't want to
I meant
like
to ask
talk
you
about,
about it earlier.
like a system that we didn't even consider. Like I do think it's a great one, but of course it's not part of what like the mandate of this. But yeah, I mean, I think we should just move on.
Sure. Well, little plug there. Definitely look that up. So where else might we want to be adopting proportional representation? So Cambridge in the United States, and I think in North America, Cambridge, Massachusetts is the only town that still uses proportional representation. They use a single transferable vote.
So they're certainly the longest, like the only one that's still around since like the 40s when this first started happening.
Yeah.
There's a couple that have adopted it much more recently, and may not even have like had full elections. Also, Minneapolis does use it for like their parks board, but not for their city council. So
Okay.
um,
Yeah, but councils which focus on issues and policy may especially benefit from proportional representation. And that might be more so the case than councils that are focusing on local governing. You know, if we're looking at like, who should we hire to repave the sidewalks? That's not a question that you necessarily want proportional representation for. You might want like the most qualified, most popular elected leaders making less controversial decisions, but in councils focusing on issues and policy where there really are like disagreements about, you know, whole philosophy of governing, definitely proportional representation can allow you to have that more seats, like everyone's got a seat at the table, and then you've just got more eyes on the considerations and the pros and cons, so you may be more likely to have a better one decision in the long run. And then definitely organizations or bodies where control often swings between factions are pretty ideal for star PR. So, you know, if like faction A is, you know, wins with like 51%, and then they treat the other side awful for their entire term, and then there's a re-election and the other side gets 51%. Rather than swinging back and forth and having like a bipolar government, definitely those are great opportunities for proportional representation. So even internal party elections could be a good one, especially political parties that have multiple really different factions that are kind of vying for a voice.
and just because proportional representation is a little bit more stable in that way, it doesn't like tend to swing back and forth. That's also a better incentive, not just for the winner, but also for the loser. Like, you know, for the 49%, like the 51% can be just like, oh, we won, like you lose, haha, so sorry, like, you know, like, you know, but the 49% can also be like, why should we ever cooperate with you when like we can just, you know, block you from doing anything. The voters will get mad at you because you didn't do anything, and then we'll win next time. So there's this sort of perverse incentive to like deliberately hurt, you know, the general interest in order to like possibly win the next election. Mm-hmm. And proportional representation just gets rid of that, like that complete perverse incentive.
Yeah, and one other thing, just talking about parties. So we did mention how we kind of don't like partisan voting. Choose one is kind of partisan because vote splitting forces it to be. So if you choose a good nonpartisan proportional system, I suspect partisanship will go away to a large extent just because you're disempowering the party structure so much. So in a multi-member district, a independent is much more likely to be elected. a good person could potentially court a few parties to try and support them. Or they could kind of say that they are okay with the policies of two parties or something like that. The lines drawn between the candidate and the party get a lot more blurred in this scenario because they're not, the candidate isn't dependent on the endorsement of the party in order to run in the first place.
And that also means that there's more you know, vibrant like debate and you know, a realistic reflection of how voters are, not only between parties but also within parties. And that's I think healthy for parties being able to, like, you know, move forward and not just get stuck in whatever platform they had 20 years ago.
Right. Yeah. I think a lot of people who get excited about voting reform are here for the let's break two-party domination talking point. And definitely something to consider with proportional representation and also with more expressive, more representative single winner systems is that if we had a more representative system, we would have more representative parties. So right now we have two parties, definitely a majority doesn't feel really well represented by either. With a better system, even if we only had two parties, we'd have two more representative parties. And I think that single winner star voting could do a lot to empower multiple viable political parties. But definitely in terms of real world data on that, the only systems that have really been linked to breaking two-party domination fully are proportional representation systems. So it is probably part of the equation there.
I thought the approval system that was in Venice did that. Am I misremembering?
The Venice system was really complex, and like, let's not get into that. Like,
sure. But I mean, it's not PR, and I don't think that there was strong partisanship.
The ancient Venice system?
We're talking 1500s or so.
Yeah.
It lasted 400 years, so it lasted for longer than any other voting method that we can discuss. But.
Sure, but either way, I don't think that it's a necessary or sufficient criteria to be PR in order to break two-party domination.
Fair.
Yeah, and I think that's an important takeaway. Another thing that I think just philosophically can be confusing or is worth bringing up is that having more representative winners doesn't necessarily mean that you have a governing body that is effective and that produces representative legislation. So, and that's a thing where
we can get some really representative people that still suck at governing.
Right. Or you could elect a totally consensus, centrist-y, compromisey set of homogenous candidates, and they agree on everything, and so they get everything done really quickly. They get a lot done, and because they're kind of representing this average position, most people feel pretty good about effective government. Whereas if you have a really diverse set of people trying to make complex decisions, they are going to disagree more. You may end up with better crafted proposals in the first place and hopefully passing better representation or better legislation because of those diverse considerations that were taken into account. But there are I think there's pros and cons to the different approaches. So with voting theory, a lot of the time there's pros, and anyone who tells you one way or the other is probably glossing over some details.
So we're at 2 hours. Do we want to give it up to the floor now? How are we going to do questions? I've tried to keep up with the questions in the chat pretty well, but if anybody still has any burning questions or clarifications, I think I told one person that was a longer question that we should wait for the end. Here we go.
So Annie may have been taking a stack or taking questions in order.
I have a list. Do you want me just to post them in the chat one by one?
Or could you just read us one?
Yeah.
Start with.
So the first question is from Marcus. He said, what is the evidence linking closed list systems to increased polarization / partisanship? So I think that was from one of the first slides.
And presenters, raise your hand or hit the buzzer if you're burning to answer that.
So there's debate on that. There's some recent studies that actually say disagree with that, but and unfortunately, like the reference that I can give is one of one of these more recent studies that disagrees with that, but the in the bibliography of that one, you'll find the ones that support this idea. I'm sorry, I can't do better than that off like
my point on that isn't so much that the position of the, let's say, the party line moves further away from each other. It would be that the candidates of the party are closer to the party line. So if you're doing, so a party list is essentially a top-down system. So those aren't candidates that get some grassroots support and then say, hey, I want to run, and they go out and they get a bunch of candidates. It's essentially chosen from the party. There tend to be party insiders. They can be flown in as what's known like carpetbaggers. But it still happens in other systems. We have somebody in Canada that got elected that was living in New York beforehand. So I would think that if you're going to picture like the ideological landscape, if you had a bunch of pillars at 3 or 4 different positions, that's a problem, even if they're not particularly far away from each other. There's a lot of space in between those. And if a party's kind of a big tent, and so that like they overlap a lot, that's a better goal. And I think there's a lot of at least anecdotal evidence about how if you let the party choose a bunch of people rather than they kind of work their way up from grassroots, you're not going to get as diverse of set within the party.
Yeah, and just to add on that, I think everyone's probably familiar with the caricature of like used car salesmen and lawyers and politicians being not the most honest people. And when you have a really partisan system, the more partisan, the more it is that way. Because let's say I want to run for office. I'm a square peg, but in order to be viable, I need to fit myself into this round hole. So I need to convince the party that I support their platform. I need to convince partisan voters that I can represent them. So I'm kind of going to be like tailoring all of my messaging to fit this party before I even try and like win over voters.
Yeah,
and vice versa. Parties are kind of tailoring themselves based on like what they think can win, which is a bit different than what the voters actually are in a given moment. So taking out that middleman should just generally be a bit more representative across the board.
If you look at how parties actually select the people, they have many people try and convince them to endorse them. And unless you get the endorsement of a party, you have to run as an independent, and then you're basically unviable. So they're already, even in the existing systems, selecting to make the party more monolithic. And like I was saying a few minutes ago, if the system doesn't have that mechanism, if it doesn't choose one, so you have to be tied to a party that you could say you're okay with these 3 parties, or 2 parties could say they think you're awesome, or whatever. It doesn't really matter. Then that just breaks down that whole dynamic.
Yeah. So taking off my equal vote hat, I'm not pro parties or anti parties either direction, but definitely just objectively speaking, lots of voters don't identify with the party, and you want a system that is able to represent everyone.
Yeah. In Canada, we have 2% registered voters, too. That's nobody identifies with a party here.
Wow. And you have lots of parties. I mean, there's like
5.
5 that I can.
5 viable ones. We had a bunch more.
So I posted a paper reference in the chat that relates to this polarization issue. Sorry.
Yeah, there's another question about mixed member. Mixed member is a partisan system. Okay, so here's my quick hot take on mixed member. You're adding party list, which is partisan and choose one, with first past the post, which is what we have now. Some of the issues with those two systems cancel each other, and some of those issues you get them wholesale or they compound. I just don't really see it as great. There's a lot of reworks of MMP. The one that they're proposing in Quebec right now doesn't even pass Hare quota criteria because they've played with the knobs on it so much. I just don't think it's a great path forward, even if it didn't have the partisan voting, which it does have.
Annie, definitely. I know you've got a stack, so let's go through it in that order.
All right. So next question is from Katrina. Are there any states that already have any of these systems?
Not the cardinal ones we've discussed today, no. These are new, less than 5 years old.
Yeah, and even the older ones that we did consider, we have newer fine tunings on. So the reality is, like, single transferable vote, proportional ranked choice voting was invented, what, over 150 years ago? It's older than instant runoff, right?
Right.
And so when they invented it, they didn't, vet it with simulations. They had a lot less information at their fingertips for vetting a new system. Now we have, we have statistics, and we have modeling, and we have computers. We have a much more advanced ability to be answering all of these questions. And I think, as we said, we kind of only hit the tip of the iceberg in terms of what could or should be done to vet a system that would be the holy grail for the whole world. But definitely in voting theory, modern systems are just going to be vetted at a much higher bar than older systems. That doesn't mean that some older systems might not still stand the test of time, but older systems should have to reprove themselves with modern science, in my opinion.
Next question is from Aravi. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. What is the proposal for the size of districts for the multi-winner star? Merge existing districts into multi-winner districts, or increase the total membership in the state legislature?
Same number of members, group them in 5. I mean, you can quibble about if then it has to be multiples of 5, so maybe you add a few, but in general, I don't see any strong motivation based on the system to add more members. If you want more members for whatever reason, sure.
So for how many winners should be like in a multi-member or multi-seat district? That's definitely a whole nother question that has pros and cons that we didn't really do a deep dive on. But in general, we were kind of looking at winner sets between like 2 and 10, or more specifically, probably in the ideal range of like 3 or 4 to 6 or 7. With 5 always ends up in that sweet spot, no matter what we're talking about. I keep seeing 5 come up, but 5-star voting.
5 is what's used in pretty much all the STV systems. So there's a fair bit of historical reason for that.
All right, another question from Aravi. In classical STV, you have one person, one effective vote. How do you normalize the choices here to ensure the same thing? For example, you could have one person rank their top 3 choices as all 5s, while another may rank them as 5, 4, 3. How are these normalized? I posted that in the chat too.
So that's done by the allocation. Like when once you actually elect somebody, your vote either gets used up as one vote, as one part of a quota, like it's each vote is equal in terms of like its ability to like fill a quota, or it doesn't get used up. So in that way, in that sense, it's very much like STV. The ranking is used to find the first winner, but once that winner is found, like you use up the votes that were the most decisive in getting them there, by allocation. So it really does still meet that same basic STV like idea of like, you get to elect one person and then you're done, which is
There's kind of two distinct concepts here. There's the scores you put on the ballot, and then there's your ballot weight, just like in STV where you have the weight of your ballot, which should all be the same, and then your rankings. So you don't have to normalize, like somebody made a comment about cumulative voting. You don't normalize the scores. You just use the scores to decide how to spend your ballot weight or allocate or whatever you're doing with the ballot weight.
Yeah.
So, so these cardinal systems pass the ranked choice definition of equality, but that's not true in reverse. So one concept I think I got into before was that me as a voter, if I got my 8th choice, my entire vote could be spent on that candidate in single transferable vote. Whereas if I'm getting my last choice, or not last, but I'm getting somebody who's really not anywhere near my favorite, in some of these cardinal systems, I would only, I would be counted as barely represented, not fully represented, and I would still have a chance to get more representation going forward. So,
but on the other hand, that opens up possibilities of strategy. So we, we discussed this, and like there's trade-offs there. But so the system that we actually, like the allocated score system, which is our main recommendation, our first recommendation, doesn't have that. Like it is more like STV in the sense that Sarah just talked about, in that like once you get used up, like unless you happen to be on the exact edge of like whether like of the people who are getting used up, but once you get used up, generally speaking, you get used up fully. Whether you gave that candidate a 5, like whether you wanted one of the 100 people who gave that candidate a 5, or like later on you're getting down to like other candidate, like the candidate wins and their top ratings are all just 3s. Well, if you're one of those top ratings, your vote will get used up fully.
right.
That reduces the chance of strategy, because you don't want to like deliberately lower down to 3 in order to like not like in order to have more left over later.
Right. So sorry. That point that I just made was actually more true of the sequentially spent score system
Exactly.
than it is of the allocated score system. But definitely in terms of equality, with allocated score, 2 voters with the same ballot are going to have their ballot treated the same. Whereas with single transferable vote, that's not the case.
Yes.
All right, so this next one is more of a comment than a question, and it was from a while back, so I don't know if this has been clarified, but Erica had written, I'm still confused about the extra star distribution. I think probably talking about the, now I forgot what it's called, but you guys know what I mean.
Surplus handling?
Allocation.
Right, and maybe this is something that'll be clarified once we can get some really great graphics out there.
Video
I don't know if you guys,
helpful.
yeah, and if anybody loves graphic design, or have any skills whatsoever, we'll
Literally any skills whatsoever. There's
anything.
only a handful of us doing this.
So say that like the quota, we had the example that quota is like 100 votes, and say you have 80 people who gave that person a 5, so those would get used up fully because that's less than 100. And then you have 30 people who gave that person a 4. Well, you only needed 20, but you have 30, so you have like you're gonna give back like 10 of those 30, like you're gonna you're gonna spread them among all 30 of those people. So each one of them gets sort of like a third of a vote weight back. If instead of being 30, it was like there's 60 people who gave them a 4, well then now you're going to give them 2/3 back because you have 60 instead of 20, and so like.
So so if you have twice as many voters as you need, everyone's going to get half their vote back.
Right.
And the easiest way to explain that, I think, is the analogy of spending money and then getting back change. So if me, Keith, and Jameson go in on a pizza, we only have $5 bills, so we pool our money and we get some change back. We're then just gonna get the exact amount of change that we overspent back, and then we're gonna just share that change equally between the 3 of us. So you'll end up with the exact perfect number of vote weight in the quota and the exact perfect amount of leftovers going forward. And the people who get that leftover vote coming back are the voters who feel the least represented. So they're the ones who we most want to be able to have a say going forward and hopefully get some better representation.
And following that analogy, each candidate costs 1 quota.
Yeah.
All right. So next question, Sass asked, for a group of voters almost entirely unfamiliar with any PR system, might sequentially spent score be a better recommendation than star PR, or I guess allocated score?
I don't think so. I think it all depends on the pitch. I think Sarah has that one slide with a short summary of the system. Yeah, I think it's all about familiarity. You have some campaigns, people get used to it. All of these systems people can get familiar with. If people could sell STV 100 years ago, we can sell one of these systems now. Any one of these systems now.
And also, I mean, like this presentation, we've sort of tried to go into like helping you understand all the different ones, but that means like, that means giving you sort of different ways of looking at all these issues. But like if you're trying to sell it, of course, you give whatever way makes the one you're trying to sell look simplest. And really, there are different ways of explaining that make each one of these look simplest. So it really depends. Like it's more about making good materials and like good visuals that help you get the intuition behind any one of these methods.
And then again, for all proportional representation, in practice, really the pitch is the same. So that is like, if there's 4 seats up for election and I have 1/4 of the voters, then I would win one of those seats. And so the pitch focuses on the what are we doing here, rather than focusing on the how are we getting there. And if you tried to find an Australian or somebody from Ireland where they have used single transferable vote ranked choice proportional for 100 years in some cases, those people would not be able to explain the algorithm to you at all. They might not even know there is an algorithm. Nobody might have ever told them that.
I've met people in Canada that thinks our first past the post system is proportional. They're like, yeah, they take my vote, they go to the parliament, and then they do some math, and that's how it works. And it's just like, no, that's not how it works. You're voting for an actual person. Like, no, we vote for a party here. And it's just like, really, dude?
Yeah. So I think what's more relevant is, can we convince the people who are making the decision which system is best, and then and actually put forward a good proposal for the voters so that whether or not they want to look under the hood, it's going to check out. But definitely none of you, if you're all holding your clipboard just waiting for COVID to be over and you're really excited to canvas for this and you got really despondent because you're never going to be able to explain all of this to people on the curb, don't worry, this is not the pitch. And it's definitely not the elevator pitch.
So I've got another question, and actually we've caught up with our chat if you wanted to look at it. And I'm not sure if Michael was talking about IRV here or allocated score, but he said with fractional surplus handling, you end up randomly selecting groups of voters, correct? How robust are the different systems at producing the same results with different random selections?
That's the point. Allocated score is not random. It's a fraction. It's not a random fraction either. It's just you can do the math, right? So let's go a little bit further on that. So say your ballot is now worth 2/5. Somebody you were scoring 5 before and would have contributed 5 to the sum to getting them elected. When you sum up all the scores, you're now at 2/5. So your 5 would then become a 2. So you now contribute 2 to that sum. So it's just math. It's a fraction.
Yeah, so that question might have been asked before we explained it too, with the change analogy. And but the only system that does it randomly is the ranked choice single transferable vote one.
And that only in some places, like here in Cambridge.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes they, I guess, do it fractionally because they don't want to be random.
Yeah. There's like 10 different STV surplus handling mechanisms. Yeah, there's a bunch of different trade-offs, and like everybody came up with a different one.
Right. So just like regardless of the variations of the algorithm, they call it all single transferable vote. We can really do the same on our side, where proportional star voting is a star ballot counted with a proportional algorithm. And technically that can be like a bit of an umbrella term. And then we're going to recommend a specific version that's vetted and that's, recommended. But over time, it is conceivable that we'll do a bunch more data. We'll have better, more sophisticated simulations. Some brilliant person who's 12 right now may come up with like a way simpler way to do this. And so we do want to reserve the right to update our recommendations if better systems do come along, because this is the cutting edge.
Yeah. I would clarify that there's probably more diversity amongst the multi-member cardinal systems than amongst the different branches of STV. And that is probably mainly due to the fact that you can do a lot more things with a number than you can do with a rank. Like you can just multiply it and move it around and shuffle it in different ways, whereas a rank is kind of really only one way you can count them down.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Go ahead.
The next one is from Chris Mason. Says so this sounds like it is trying to do the opposite of block voting in Utah.
So I'm not sure about the in Utah bit of that, but definitely block voting in terms of like multi-winner elections. On one side, you've got block voting, which is basic multi-winner, where you're electing like the most popular candidate and then the next most popular candidate until all your seats are filled, versus proportional. Block voting is like, I want the most popular candidates, and proportional is I want the most diversified candidate set that's the most representative of the full spectrum of voters. So they're really opposite goals. And there's no way to say that one is better than the other. The question is, what are we trying to accomplish here? For governmental elections, maybe you can argue one's better than the other. We definitely don't recommend like at-large block voting for big governmental things, with very few exceptions, because it's super problematic in certain cases. So
can I speak? Yeah, I mean, block plurality is, for plurality, like for I mean, it's the block version of plurality, and that was instituted very deliberately as a Jim Crow measure, like as a racist thing in the South and in a lot of places, and not just in the South, in fact. And so, I mean, you know,
Yeah, in the
this-
Voting Rights Act.
towns over here in Lowell, like there was a very explicit, like they had proportional representation and they went to block voting for very explicitly racist reasons. But so, and the Utah, the thing in Utah, they call it ranked choice voting, and they're like, yay, it's all ranked choice voting. And that's one of the problems with like having these umbrella labels, which actually refer to a bunch of different methods. You know, ranked choice voting is used for IRV for single winner. It's used for STV for multi-winner proportional. And then they were like, well, we're already using it for those two things, so why don't we also use that same label for the block multi-winner version, which is potentially you know, like a racist kind of thing, or like a Jim Crow kind of measure. The two towns where it's being used in Utah are like very, very highly Republican towns, where almost certainly like there's hardly any like non-white people in those towns, in those little towns that there are, but they're trying to make it legal on a statewide basis, and it could be very much a problem that way. So it's very important not to like get caught up in just like a label, and actually look under the hood and what's going on. And that's the kind of work that we in this committee were trying to do.
Yeah, and that is why we're, you know, encouraging you all to sit through a deep dive on this subject, because obviously it's easier to just be like, we're the experts because we do it because we said so. But really it's important to have a well-educated activist base and a well-educated population. But on that racist block voting thing, I just want to explain that a tiny bit more, because it's really important. So especially in places where like communities are segregated, or where you have like a Black neighborhood that's surrounded by white neighborhoods, if you were to have you know, each community independently have their own district, then you're going to get a representative person for that Black community. Whereas if you lump them in with all the rest of the whole city, then and have at-large winners, then you're gonna get you're never gonna get a person that represents that community, even though they had enough voters to deserve a spot. And so that is a really important thing, when I think a lot of people are sold proportional representation because they want equitable, diverse representation racially and gender-wise as well. And those are things that single winner district-based elections are actually sometimes better at, particularly because we do have a historical context where people are living in communities. We don't have a homogenous population. We have people living with people like them, and communities that are, you know, segregated, either historically on purpose or continuing on those trends.
Which I mean, we didn't talk about this too much. The concept of proportionate representation. So that is that each region has the same number of representatives. And I mean, sure, there's ethnic neighborhoods, but I mean, on a larger level, if your whole city is just not getting any representatives because all of the people from all of the parties live at the capital, and me from Vancouver, very far from the capital of Canada, we tend to get less representation just because a lot of the people come from back east. But that would be worse in a PR system, not better. So, you know, thinking about what the decisions the people are actually making, are they ideological decisions, or should we give funding to build a bridge there? So some of them can be really local-based decisions, and some of them can be really ideological decisions. And it's important to consider the interplay between that, especially for different levels of government. I mean, so yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So single winner elections with single winner districts guarantee perfect proportionate geographical representation. Yeah, just
And
like
in Canada, it's actually in our constitution, proportionate representation. You have to have that at least at the level of the provinces. So we couldn't go to a party list system without, or probably an MMP system without changing our constitution. So you need at least geographical clusters at the province level at the largest.
right, and we could do that as well. You know, at the state level, we can ensure that that each state is taken as like a unique cluster, and so you would have X number of people guaranteed from the state.
Yeah, it's like the number of electoral college votes, kind of like that. That's guaranteed, I assume, in your constitution somewhere.
Yeah, or electoral votes from the House if you discard the ones from the Senate.
Sure.
The Senate is not proportionate, and the House is proportionate.
Right.
To the degree, you know, within the margin of error. But I digress. Do we have more questions, or are we ready for our in conclusion slide?
I think that was all of them, unless I missed something.
Awesome.
There's a question that just popped up. I'm a grad student organizing a series of public debates on alternative voting systems. Might someone from Equal Vote like to participate? Yeah, I like debating. I'll debate. Jameson will probably. Jameson, would you be interested in debating?
Sure. Yeah. Like, get in touch. Like, I'm interested to hear more.
Yeah, our emails are on our website for anybody that wants to reach out.
So one thing there, when we convened this committee, I was the only one on the committee from the Equal Vote Coalition. But 2 years later, Jameson and Keith are both board members for the Equal Vote Coalition now, and we're excited to have them. I think having, you know, experts in the field and people with their credentials is really helpful for the Equal Vote Coalition. And also you guys are just great people. But all three of us, our email is firstname@equal.vote. So in conclusion, proportional star voting is one part of a cohesive star voting family. So you've got single winner, multi-winner, and proportional star that can all be done with a 5-star ballot. Allocated score voting is a vetted and recommended algorithm for tabulating star PR. A number of proposals were determined to be viable options, and the committee encourages more study and piloting of the top 3 finalists. So the 3 that really almost maybe could have won were allocated score, which actually did, sequentially spent score, and sequential Monroe. So definitely those are all ones that we hope would be considered in further studies. And future studies planned include a few things. So Parker Friedland, who's not here tonight, but was a super engaged member of our committee, is working on a criteria checker that would allow you to just like take a voting method system or a variation, run it through the criteria checker and be like, oh, it's passes these ones, but doesn't pass that one. That would be rad. Currently that process is much more laborious. We'd definitely love to do more sophisticated simulations with different election scenarios and definitely digging into more specific strategies. And some of the concepts that we raised were really things that hadn't been discussed or like written up ever before anywhere, or that hadn't been like applied in this context. So we definitely want to do a lot more with the idea of measuring what is an ideal winner set, not just like looking at how much each candidate deserved to have won, but how do those candidates interplay with the other candidates, and what's like our average outcome there. And with the Pareto frontier concept as well, I think that's something that's going to keep on returning more light bulbs in the future. And then definitely we encourage a lot more research into optimal trade-offs between the various constraints, because like diverse representation, or Jameson, what's the technical term for that? Descriptive.
Yes.
Descriptive representation, you know, comes at the cost of overall utility, like average voter satisfaction with the winners. So how do you optimize that? So yeah, Keith and Jameson, any other things that you're really excited to see studied, even if you're not sticking your hand up to start working on that tomorrow?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have, I'm working on a metric for proportional methods that measures voting power for each voter, like a rigorous definition for what your voting power is that works for multiple different methods, and then also your amount of choice for those candidates who do have some voting power, because if you have no power, there's no real way to measure what choice you have. And so that's kind of separate from the work of this committee. Like, wasn't really on the agenda for this committee, but I'm working on that and hope to publish it possibly this year.
Cool. Keith, somehow you got muted, and I'm gonna guess.
Hi, there was some noise in the background here, so I muted. So in a similar vein, I want to look more into the strict definitions of PR. So there's a concept of winner set stability, which is used in academic circles a fair bit. And there's a concept of justified representation and proportional justified representation that I'd like to look into a little bit more, and which systems pass this. There is some interplay between what is exactly proportional and what is still proportional enough while being very strategically resistant to strategy. And I'd like to understand that a little bit more.
The concept of the core and various relaxations of that game theory concept. So yeah, there's a lot of theory still to be done here.
Yeah, there's still like actual academic, like mathematics and comp sci papers being written on stuff like this. It's just not in the context of electing government bodies. It's really a lot more esoteric.
Hmm.
And it's actually quite like an active field. Like as of like 3 years ago to now, it's really heated up. So it's exciting stuff is happening.
Yeah, well, I hope that we're lighting some of that fire. Definitely for my part, one of the things that I went into this really curious about and would still love to know more about is how voting methods can be used to combat polarization. Like, is there a way to maximize that diversification of candidates while also not compromising on accountability? So there's a difference between a candidate who's all the way over in left field ideologically, who actually is really pretty well liked by people who disagree with them. They're a respectable person, they're a compassionate person, but we just maybe agree to disagree, versus someone who's like polarizing in a really adversarial, antagonistic, awful sort of hateful way. And with a choose one voting method, you don't really know how to tell the difference. But with a 5-star ballot, you can not only look at, you know, how many people gave that person high scores, but how many people gave them zeros. And if you got, zeros from literally everyone else besides your block of voters, that is not ideal. So definitely, I think there is potential for proportional star voting to combat that. I think our proposal does, but that's not something that's been like really lasered in on.
Yeah. On a similar slant, there's like the overall quality and niceness of the person. And that's another reason why I'm not a big fan of either first past the post, which pushes partisan voting, or things that are explicitly partisan, because people tend to not pay much attention to the actual candidate they're voting for. They tend to just vote for the party or the leader of the party. I'd really want people to actually spend their time and get to know each of the candidates and then, score them properly. So I think giving people the ability to do that will kind of force them to do that a little bit better. And that's another one of the issues with a multi-member system versus a single member system. So in general, you're going to have say you have 5 seats, you're going to have 5 times as many candidates. That's 5 times as many people to learn. And then you're fighting back down the other side of that slope where people have to learn many more people and better. So there's so many trade-offs in this ecosystem that it's really hard to know what the best balance in terms of just getting a good parliament or a good house or whatever. So yeah, more information about trying to get likable people elected.
Cool. Well, as we're wrapping up, I want to thank everyone who's still on the call with us for doing this deep dive, for caring about this issue. And if you're looking at adopting proportional representation, maybe for a group that you're a part of or something like that, one update is that we now have the capability to tabulate elections that are run with allocated score. We don't have that live on our star.vote website yet, but we do have, behind the scenes, we have that code written and that tool built. So if you do run an election and you use 5-star ballots and you can put your results in a spreadsheet, we can tally that for allocated score for you. So you can just email elections@equal.vote if you have any election officiation type questions for PR or for single winner.
Yeah. And spend some time on Elector Wiki. The code for allocated score is there. If there's any developers out there that want to build their own thing.
Yeah, and then in terms of real world advocacy, proportional representation and allocated score are not part of any of our ballot initiatives. They're not part of our new bill in the legislature. 3250 House bill for Oregon is now live. It doesn't include proportional representation. So that's something that isn't on the front burner for us in terms of like large scale governmental advocacy, but for people like, for countries like Canada, it may be on the table much sooner. And it definitely could be on the table sooner, but it's not our top priority right now. And I think one thing in terms of a lot of people, election reformers disagree on, do we ever want proportional? Do we always want it? But for people who really want it and they want it for most things in the long run, we really do think that adopting single winner star voting is a great stepping stone, because for the voter, it's the same. So it's, I think, really effective to win people over with single winner voting methods that are just much more transparent. They make sense. They're much more simple. And then get them comfortable with it, get them trusting it before trying to introduce this whole other concept. I think trying to introduce both a more expressive ballot and a proportional algorithm at the same time is enough to make a lot of people kind of go, well, maybe I feel more comfortable with the status quo.
Yeah, and if you really want,
So just to like, we skipped over place before, and place is sort of like the other side of that dichotomy. Place is an idea that gets you proportional and gets you like really well justified and like high high resolution representation with a very familiar like single winner the single choose one style ballot. It's not exactly the same as the ballot you have, but it looks very familiar. So that there's different ways to attack this issue, and I think that it's worth like pushing on all the fronts, right? Like it's not a competition. Like there's plenty of room for all of these ideas to be moving forward.
and for those people that are huge advocates of proportional representation, but constantly say no to single winner systems, single winner star is much more proportional than first past the post. Like it's probably more than half of the way to allocated score. I don't know how I would actually find a way to compute that, like using realistic data, but just getting rid of vote splitting would make the Gallagher index probably much closer to what you get from allocated score.
Right. So I think earlier we mentioned pass-fail metrics for like what exactly is a proportional system, and pass-fail metrics in general obviously don't tell you if something's halfway there. But the Gallagher index is another metric. There's other metrics that measure how proportional is something, definitely, which can be easily measured for individual elections and can be measured for voting methods in general. So I think that is a good piece of data I'd love to have for single winner star.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible though. You'd have to do the strategy fairly for each individual system, and I don't think that's possible.
I'm sorry, it's getting pretty late where I am right now. So
Right.
Good night.
Yeah. Well, I
everyone.
think we're all done. So definitely thank you, Jameson, for joining us and tonight, but especially for this entire 2-year extensive process. Thank you, Keith, for joining us for this extensive process and tonight and on our board. And thank you, Annie, for helping officiate this, and to all of our participants. We really appreciate you. I know this has been long, but we did record the video of the whole thing. And we also have kind of an ebook of the slideshow that somebody could read through much quicker. So we'll be sharing that on social media and in our email blast and on our website. So yeah, good night, everyone.
No.